Let me start with a little anecdote. I am an ethicist, which is apparently a rare breed, which doesn't mean that I'm a terribly virtuous person, but I am fascinated by this thing. But I also, in the course of my academic career, came across this idea that really I should get out more in the real world and figure out what it takes to be ethical in the real world, particularly in terms of environmental ethics. So recently I was a municipal executive, and I helped my municipality to get our sustainability program going. And I'm happy to announce we have, since last week, an energy cooperative. That all worked. But I also learned something really important, and that is I need to go back to, just working? Yeah. I need to go back to writing about virtues and to telling about virtues, because the main obstacle I came across while I was in municipal government was simply what we all know: greed, power, fear, the very opposite of virtues like generosity and humility and courage. These are essential elements that make a transition possible. They're not always necessary, but without them, it's a struggle. And the thing is, as an ethicist, I just happen to know that these terms, these virtues, are not as difficult to cultivate as we might think. There's a lot of new tools we have available to do this. And so I'd like to talk about that today. Virtue cultivation. Virtue cultivation you can imagine as the art of flourishing, how to flourish and to let flourish. That's the question, how to flourish and to let flourish. This is an ancient art. It's not anything new, but it does get very little attention in our modern societies, and this is despite the people who thought up the systems we have. Montesquieu thought of democracy as we know it, said it's not going to work without such virtues as fairness, industriousness, frugality. I saw that earlier on one of the slides. We need people who have these virtues, or else the system won't work. Same for Adam Smith, the invisible hand. He assumed that the actors that were all going to be doing the right thing for themselves would be making those judgments as virtuous people with frugality, industriousness, and a whole other range of virtues. So it wasn't a narrow self-interest, it was a very broad self-interest. John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism, you know, all the cost-benefit analysis we have. He said you can only really assess costs and benefits well when you are a noble type of character, by which he meant virtuous. And he specifically said that means that you have learned to appreciate your relatedness to all other creatures. This is an aspect of John Stuart Mill we don't usually hear about. So our current system assumes that we have cultivated virtues, and yet we hardly ever talk about that. This is not part of our policies anymore, or if it is, it sounds horribly outdated. It sounds very conservative. It sounds like, oh my God, the finger is pointing at me. And that's real pity. So I'm not so much wedded to the term virtue, but I mean, who wants to live out courage? It's a perfectly okay term, isn't it? Wouldn't you agree? I mean, and we can do something about that. Let us imagine, because virtues are kind of abstract, that our sustainable civilization that we hope will arise might look like a teepee. There you got one, a teepee. The poles of this teepee are solidly anchored in the underground economy of the soil. There you got it. Underground economy. Here you see little bacterioids sitting in the root of a soybean, giving it fertilizer. I mean, this is a great example of symbiosis, working right underneath in the soil, giving us enormous benefits and powers, and any kind of sustainable system that we want to build up, any kind of civilization will somehow have to fit in with this, or else it's not going to work. So our poles, our teepee poles, are in that economy which is already working for us, and we better well respect that. If they are solidly rooted, it will be a very resilient home, and you will feel that as you see the teepee or feel the teepee go around. You see, I put the poles in the cardboard. You need that. Well, what are these poles? Well, I call them poles, but they are really powers. Virtue, the Latin virtu, means manly power. Well, we may want to have issue with the manly part, but virtue stands for power. It's a kind of power that enables you and your community to flourish, but it's an invisible power, it's an immaterial power, and that's why I like to use metaphors that give some body to it. So here we got poles, the teepee has poles, and I have given my teepee, our teepee, colorful poles, because these powers are so very wonderful. Look, there is a green pole. What does it stand for? Well, the power of trust near the entrance of the teepee. Without trust, you cannot have a sustainable civilization. The power of courage, orange pole near the back. Strong, you need it. You need to be able to stand when there are difficulties. Care, light blue pole. It is a very beautiful light blue because our care makes it shine. Has it gone all the way around? Has everybody experienced the teepee? There's still some people? Okay, all right, thank you. Within this teepee, just imagine that there are various floors. It's kind of, imaginary teepee, and different embedded systems, and we've heard more about embedded systems today, are living in this teepee. And you and I, we're living sort of in a middle floor between, bacteria and household systems and villages and cities and who knows what else that comes before we have the whole planet. But it's already helpful for us to think of these various systems being all related. This means that the care of the poles, or keep making the poles strong, is the job of all the embedded systems that make up this teepee. That means that if we cultivate our virtues, we simultaneously build on the capabilities, the powers of other systems, and we strengthen them. This is a very interrelated task. It also means that if we neglect the cultivation of our virtues, and that is what we are doing in our society, it's not on our agenda, then we risk not only becoming unhappy ourselves, because virtue is its own reward, but also weakening the other parts of the poles. And if this lasts long enough, our civilization collapses. What you see here is the gorge at Cornell, and then, it's kind of collapsed building there on the right. I mean, it's horrible, and it's a suicide gorge, right? And this is essentially what happens when that key part of the chain, virtue cultivation, drops out of the equation. Now, as human beings, how then do we cultivate these virtues? This is really not rocket science. Basically, we hone our virtues through everyday practices. We hone our interactive capabilities, because that's what virtues are, through essentially an age-old form of condition training. It's habit condition. It's not necessarily physical condition, although physical condition is also necessary. You cannot be a virtuous person when you are not in your own way trying to have a healthy body. This is impossible. We cultivate virtues when we engage in these everyday practices in such a way that we tend to flourish and to let flourish. So it's always a question, what does that mean? But we don't have to invent that the whole time, as long as for some of the time we are mindful and then condition ourselves to do this, have this habit going for the rest of the time. So mindful attunement to our physical and emotional and cognitive processes turns these daily ways of being and doing into a transforming and a sustaining practice. This is really important. It has to do also with your routines. We tend to think routines are terrible, but we really need them as long as we have mindfully grown into them. And this is also what you see the world religions have taught. All the religions that I know stress this. Mindful spiritual practice of your daily routines will make them actually holy and therefore make your whole life blessed. We help to maintain the poles in our teepee by making sure that in our daily routines we go around them regularly so that not one pole is forgotten. I call that row tasking, not multitasking, but row tasking. So make sure, very simply, that every day or every week at least has some aspect of all these tasks. The tasks are related, by the way, to essential capabilities that as embodied organisms we all have, and we can either improve them or we can let them atrophy. We share these capabilities with single cells and also with complex systems. I won't go into this. There's a lot of complexity behind the teepee, but too little time to explain it. You can ask me about it later. What does it mean in terms of virtues? Well, if you make sure your daily routines involve, a full spectrum of training these capabilities well so that you flourish and your environment flourishes, you will train things like trust, which is a way of being open in difficult situations. Things like nobility is an old-fashioned term, but you can also refer to it as standing up for justice, standing to have vision, when it's sometimes necessary just to stand there and not be swayed. Audacity, old-fashioned term, it means courage, endurance, daring to say things when really it needs to be said. Caution, any virtues that have to do with looking into the future and realizing, gee, the effect could be this or the effect could be that. I'm not sure, a precautionary principle. Let me carefully try one direction. If it doesn't work, I'll use the feedback to either adjust or go back to the drawing table. This is something you can practice in your daily activities, and then you'll know what to do when it's big time. And it's really important that you're used to doing it. Frugality, the same thing. You can practice it in your daily activities. Creativity, care, wonder. This is a map, essentially. I won't go into the details, but it's based on basic capabilities of organisms and can be scaled up from the single cell all the way to the city and the planet. Yeah, there we have the single cell. This is not one you want in your body, it's a paramecium, but it has actually many of these capabilities. And these are the dimensions of the map that I use. Being relatively more open to the external environment is left. On the top, going in reverse, the paramecium has little hairs that it can use to go away from something unpleasant. Going forward, and then on the right, being relatively more closed to your environment. So all virtues I have mapped on dimensions that indicate your relationship to the environment, whether that is other critters like you, or the physical environment, or some food you want to have. With respect to all these things, you can map these relations on there. Yes?
15 minutes already.
Okay, I think about 2. Is that okay? All right. There we go. Like I said, ancient traditions have a treasure trove for how to cultivate these virtues, and they're now being supplemented by the latest research in neuroscience, in social psychology. Many fields help us to cultivate these virtues. Again, this is not rocket science. Here's an example. Trust. Well, many religions say pray. Okay, well, it actually works. People who pray tend to be more trusting. But in honor of Dan Siegel, who is not here, he says, try to apply gabagoo to your inner mind, and you'll feel much more trusting. Frugality. Well, I don't have the time to go through this, but you get the gist, right? There are new tools from scientific disciplines that are incredibly useful for daily cultivation of virtues. Now back to us. I think that as a community, we have a wonderful treasure trove of knowledge about virtue cultivation, except that we don't necessarily identify it in our programs here. I think it would be helpful if we did, and if we collected our knowledge from the various disciplines we bring here to make a virtue cultivation kit that can help us to build up what I call the virtue capital that is needed for our transition into a sustainable global civilization. And if we do that, for those of us who love metrics, we can even measure how well we do. I mean, here you have my map again, and I projected it onto a radial kind of a graph that was used at the first Climate, Mind, and Behavior symposium by Mark Anielski. You can do this. You can map to see how far you've gotten in terms of your virtue capital. It's not as vague as it might think. We have the tools to do this. But I think for the most part, whether we measure it or not, virtue cultivation is fun. I mean, not necessarily fun in the totally exciting sense, but is deeply satisfying. And this is what I mean. You'll enjoy it as you go, and the people around you will feel that. And that's probably the best thing about it, so that even if all things done, we still don't get it with this climate business, we will have a meaningful and good time along the way. But I think we will get there with this climate business if we get these virtues right. Thank you.